6 years, $50 million, and 14 elite roboticists flown in from 3 continents, and Claire's groundbreaking surgical system still sat in the clean room like a multi-million-dollar curse. Cold, lifeless, untouched by all of their expertise, no one could explain why the world's most advanced robotic surgeon froze during its most critical demonstration. Until the afternoon when Claire finally ran out of patience, turned across the glass-walled operating theater toward the man holding a mop in the corner, and said, "What about you? Do you dare even try?" No one in that room knew what was coming. Follow right now, because the story behind this machine is something you will not believe until you hear it for yourself. The atmosphere inside the clean room of Biomedica Robotics was thick with a clinical, freezing panic. The air, filtered through industrial-grade HEPA systems, carried the sterile scent of isopropyl alcohol, ozone, and the faint, bitter smell of overtaxed circuit boards. Rows of high-definition surgical monitors pulsed with a flat, mocking red, reflecting off the brushed titanium arms of the Aegis X surgical system. The machine, a $3 billion monument to modern medicine, was supposed to be the crown jewel of Claire Sinclair's tenure as CEO. It had 4 carbon fiber arms, designed to operate with a precision down to the width of a single human red blood cell. But right now, those arms were locked like the frozen talons of a steel predator, hovering exactly 3 millimeters above the chest of the sedated patient on the operating table. That patient was William Harrington. At 71, he was not only a billionaire investor but the majority stakeholder of Biomedica. He had volunteered to undergo a minor, non-invasive cardiac valve repair to prove to the global press and the watching board of directors that the Aegis X was ready for the market. His life was currently suspended in a fragile, medically induced state of sleep, his shallow breathing monitored by a machine that was slowly losing its rhythm. Standing at the primary control console was Dr. Charles Sterling. He was 48 years old, his tailored silk shirt drenched in sweat beneath his sterile blue gown. He was the chief scientific officer of Biomedica, a man whose professional reputation had been built on a series of patented breakthroughs that the scientific community regarded as legendary. But his fingers, usually so calculated and precise, were now hammering frantically on the keyboard, his face pale and hollow under the fluorescent lights. "Reset the primary servo bus. Force a cold boot on the telemetry array," Charles screamed, his voice cracking with a high-pitched terror that made the junior technicians flinch. "Why isn't the operating system accepting the override? It's rejecting my authorization codes." "The core kernel is locked, Doctor," the technician yelled back, her eyes wide as she stared at a fast-scrolling cascade of system errors. "It's not a hardware failure. The machine has entered a self-preservation protocol. If we try to force the robotic arms to move manually, the mechanical feedback will tear through the patient's arterial wall." Claire Sinclair stood at the observation window, her hands pressed flat against the reinforced glass. At 31, she was a woman who had spent her entire life proving she belonged in the highest circles of corporate power, inheriting a legacy from a father who had tolerated nothing less than perfection. Her designer heels, which usually clicked with a sharp, intimidating rhythm against the polished concrete floors, were silent. Her eyes, cold and focused, were locked on the red warning line representing William Harrington's blood pressure. It was slowly, steadily dropping. "Charles," Claire said, her voice dropping into a low, dangerous whisper over the room's intercom. "You told me the safety protocols were fully integrated. You told me the software was flawless. If William dies in that room, the FDA will seize this facility, the board will dissolve our stock, and you will spend the rest of your life in a federal prison. Fix it." "I am trying, Claire," Charles roared, his hand slipping on the console, knocking a tray of sterile tools to the floor with a clattering metallic crash. "The software is reacting to an unrecognized variable. It's like the machine has its own mind." At the back of the operating theater, standing quietly beside a cart filled with cleaning solutions and industrial mops, was Julian. He was 43 years old, dressed in the dark blue, heavy-duty cotton jumpsuit of the night shift maintenance staff. His face was weathered, his eyes carrying the heavy, quiet look of a man who had seen too much and no longer felt the need to explain himself to anyone. On his chest was a faded plastic badge that read simply, "Julian, Facilities." Outside the glass partition, in the quiet corridor of the secure wing, sat Julian's 7-year-old daughter, Mia. She was a small, delicate child who wore her hair in two neat, slightly lopsided pigtails. Because of a power fluctuation in the basement employee lounge, Julian had brought her up to the secure floor, keeping her where he could see her through the glass. Mia sat on a vinyl bench, clutching a scruffy, three-legged golden retriever therapy dog named Echo, whom Julian had rescued from a shelter years ago. Echo lay perfectly still, his head resting on Mia's lap, his tail thumping once against the floor whenever his amber eyes met Julian's through the glass. In Mia's small hands was a cheap plastic toy stethoscope. She occasionally pressed it against Echo's chest, her eyes distant and focused, listening to a world of sound that existed beneath the noise of the panic around them. Claire, her stress culminating into a sharp, unguided fury, turned away from the glass. Her eyes scanned the room for a target, any symbol of the vulnerability she despised, and landed on Julian. He was standing near the terminal, his mop resting against his shoulder, his eyes fixed on the primary telemetry screen. To her, he was a useless distraction, a low-level worker who had brought his messy life and his broken family into her pristine, high-stakes temple. She marched over to him, her breathing shallow, her heels sounding like a firing squad as they hit the concrete. With a swift, violent motion, she swiped a plastic clipboard off Julian's cleaning cart, sending it clattering to the floor near his work boots. "Why is this trash still in my clean room?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and elitist venom. "Your shift ended an hour ago, Julian. Your child and that crippled animal are a biohazard to this floor. This is a $3 billion launch and you bring your poverty and your distractions into my room? You are fired. Pack your things, take your daughter, and if I ever see you in this facility again, I will have security throw you into the street." Mia flinched at the sound of the clipboard hitting the floor, her hands flying to her ears as Echo stood up, his three legs bracing against the linoleum, letting out a low, protective whine. Julian did not look at the clipboard on the floor. He did not look at the anger in Claire's face. He slowly looked at his boots, then looked up, his eyes matching the cold, unyielding steel of the robot in the center of the room. "My daughter isn't a biohazard, Ms. Sinclair," Julian said, his voice dropping into a low, resonant register that seemed to carry more authority than any voice in that room all morning. "And the machine isn't reacting to an unrecognized variable. It's reacting to a crime." Charles laughed from the console, a frantic, hysterical sound. "He's a janitor, Claire. He's a nobody. Get him out of here before he contaminates the field." Julian ignored the doctor. He looked past Claire at the massive screen, his eyes dissecting the columns of code that were scrolling in red. He recognized the rhythm of the lines. He recognized the syntax. He recognized it because he had written the core kernel of the Aegis operating system 8 years ago, a system that had been taken from him, patented under Charles's name, and sold to the world as a miracle. The force feedback sensors in the secondary articulated arm are registering an artificial resistance of 45 newtons, Julian said, his voice steady and calm. The room went completely silent. The engineers at the back stopped typing. Charles Sterling's hand froze over the keyboard. "What did you just say?" Claire asked, her eyes narrowing as she stepped closer to him. "The pressure on the patient's arterial wall isn't real," Julian explained, pointing a grease-stained finger at the red screen. "Your chief scientific officer tried to run the live demonstration at 150% speed to make the system look faster for the press. But the mechanical joints can't handle the thermal expansion at that velocity. The sensors think they've hit a bone, so they've locked the system to prevent a rupture. It's a failsafe. A ghost code I wrote into the system before Charles stole my hard drives." Charles's face turned the color of wet chalk. He's lying. He's a saboteur. Security, arrest him." 2 armed security guards stepped into the operating room, their hands reaching for Julian's shoulders. Julian didn't resist. He stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the countdown timer on the wall. 30 seconds remained before the system initiated an automated emergency shutdown, a process that would cause the locked robotic arms to snap back, tearing William Harrington's chest apart. "Go ahead," Julian said softly to the guards. "Arrest me. But when that clock hits 0, your billionaire investor dies. Your company goes bankrupt, and the only man who knows how to sing the key to open that machine will be in the back of a police cruiser." Claire looked at the clock. She looked at Charles, whose hands were trembling so badly he couldn't hold his stylus. And then she looked at Julian, the janitor who stood before her with the quiet, ironclad dignity of a king. "Sing the key?" Claire whispered, her voice ashen. "The lock isn't digital, Claire," Julian said. "It's acoustic, and your doctor doesn't know the song." "Release him," Claire commanded, her voice cutting through the panic of the room like a cold blade. The security guards hesitated, their hands still heavy on Julian's shoulders. Under normal circumstances, they answered directly to the head of security, who answered to the chief scientific officer. But the sheer authority in Claire's eyes, coupled with the flashing red numbers on the primary telemetry screen, left no room for debate. They slowly withdrew their hands, stepping back into the shadows of the clean room's entrance. "Claire, this is madness!" Charles Sterling shrieked, his voice rising a full octave as he gestured wildly at the frozen machine. "He's a janitor. He has no clearance. If he touches that console, the entire intellectual property of Aegis X is compromised. He is going to steal our data." "There is no data left to steal if the company is bankrupt by dawn, Charles," Claire said, her voice dropping into a register that made the chief scientific officer flinch. She turned her focus entirely to Julian, her eyes scanning his faded blue jumpsuit, the dirt on his boots, and the calm, absolute certainty in his face. "You have 20 seconds, Julian. Prove you are who you say you are, or I will let these guards throw you into a holding cell." Julian didn't answer with words. He walked toward the primary control console with a slow, unhurried stride that completely ignored the ticking clock. Charles tried to stand in his way, his shoulder braced as if to physically block the console. Julian didn't even look at him. He simply extended his left arm, his broad shoulder catching Charles's chest with a fluid, unstoppable momentum that pushed the older doctor 3 feet back into a tray of sterile prep materials. The metal tray hit the floor with a deafening clatter, but Julian was already leaning over the keyboard. The clock read 15 seconds. On the screen, the red lines of the emergency lockout code were cascading in a dizzying loop, a digital barricade designed to shut down the system permanently. Julian's fingers moved across the mechanical keys, not with the frantic, trembling speed of Charles, but with a rhythmic, heavy precision. He wasn't searching for a password. He was writing a correction. "It's no use," Charles muttered, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. "The security protocol is encrypted with a 24-character alphanumeric key. Even if you wrote the base kernel, you can't bypass the hardware lock without the master token. And the master token is on my secure server." "Your secure server is a copy of my old research laboratory," Julian said, his fingers never stopping. "And like everything you took from me, you only understood the surface. You thought the safety lockout was a software barrier. But when you're dealing with robotic joints that move with enough force to crush human bone, a software barrier is a death sentence. I didn't lock the system with a digital key, Charles. I locked it with a physics equation. 10 seconds. The system began its final warning sequence. A harsh electronic horn sounded through the operating theater, a repeating mechanical wail that made the glass panels vibrate. The red light, representing William Harrington's heart rate, dipped below 45 beats per minute. "Julian!" Claire cried, her hand tightening around the glass doorframe until her knuckles turned white. Suddenly, a soft, rhythmic tapping sounded from the other side of the glass. Julian looked up. Through the double-paned glass of the observation deck, Mia had stood up from her vinyl bench. She had walked directly to the glass, her small face pressed against the cold pane, her dark eyes looking not at the flashing lights or the armed guards, but at her father. She had taken her toy stethoscope off her neck and was holding it against the glass, her fingers signing a rapid, silent message in the air. "Papa," her hands signed. "The giant is screaming. Remember the lullaby." Julian's face softened, a sudden warm light breaking through the iron mask he had worn since entering the room. He looked at the scruffy golden retriever, Echo, who was sitting perfectly still beside Mia's knees, his head tilted 3 degrees to the left, his ears twitching in sync with the high-pitched 60 hertz hum of the overtaxed cooling fans. "The lullaby," Julian whispered to himself. "What is he talking about?" Claire demanded, looking through the glass at the child. 10 years ago, Julian said, his voice carrying clearly over the hum of the computers as he looked at the primary console's microphone array. When I was building the first prototype of the Aegis X's articulated joint, my wife was dying in a hospital bed 6 blocks from my lab. I spent 48 hours straight trying to write the dampening algorithm to prevent the robotic arms from vibrating under high-speed operation. I couldn't get the frequency right. Every time I ran the motor, the metal would scream, vibrating itself into a stress fracture. He looked at Charles, who was staring at him with a mix of terror and confusion. My wife used to hum a specific low-frequency lullaby to Mia when she was a baby to help her sleep through the noise of the city, Julian continued. One night, out of sheer exhaustion, I recorded her voice and analyzed the waveform on my oscilloscope. Her voice had a natural, perfect harmonic dampening frequency of exactly 432 Hz. It was a sound that didn't fight the metal, it absorbed the friction. Julian leaned down toward the sterile, directional microphone mounted on the console, the mic normally used by the chief surgeon to log notes during a procedure. 5 seconds. "What are you doing?" Charles whispered. Julian closed his eyes. He didn't type. He didn't look at the screen. He took a deep, steadying breath, and then, in a low, resonant baritone, he began to hum. It wasn't a melody that any of the Ivy League engineers in the room recognized. It was a single, long, undulating tone that seemed to vibrate in the very center of their chests. It was a sound that felt out of place in a room filled with $3 billion of silicon and steel. A sound that belonged to a quiet bedroom in a cold, rainy city. As his voice hit the 432 Hz threshold, a strange thing happened. The high-pitched metallic screaming of the Aegis X's cooling fans began to soften. The violent, microscopic shaking of the carbon fiber arms ceased entirely. On the primary diagnostic monitor, the jagged red lines of the telemetry loop suddenly smoothed, shifting from an angry, pulsing red to a calm, steady gold. Acoustic handshake confirmed, a synthetic female voice announced over the room's speakers. The sound was a digital ghost rising from the depths of the operating system, a voice that had not been heard in that building in 8 years. Safe state protocol engaged, releasing torque lockout. With a soft, pneumatic hiss, the 4 titanium arms of the Aegis X slowly raised themselves away from William Harrington's chest, returning to their neutral, safe state alignment like a steel bird spreading its wings in retreat. On the anesthesia monitor, the billionaire's heart rate immediately stabilized, the green line tracing a steady, normal rhythm of 68 beats per minute. The room was so quiet that the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor sounded like an explosion. No one moved. No one spoke. The elite engineers, who had spent the last 3 days trying to solve the problem with multi-million-dollar software sweeps, stood paralyzed, their eyes moving from the perfectly stable patient to the man in the blue canvas jumpsuit. Claire Sinclair slowly let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 6 years. She looked at the gold screen, then at the tattered clipboard on the floor, and finally at Julian. He was already stepping back from the console, his hands returning to the pocket of his jumpsuit, his posture shifting back into the quiet, invisible safety of a janitor. He looked through the glass at Mia, who was now smiling, her toy stethoscope clutched to her chest, as Echo let out a soft, happy bark that echoed through the observation corridor. It's stable," a junior technician whispered, her voice trembling with a wild, disbelieving relief. "The pressure is back to normal. The system is completely responsive." Claire walked into the operating theater, her heels clicking on the concrete, but this time the sound was slow, hesitant, and heavy with a shame she had never permitted herself to feel before. She stopped 3 feet from Julian. "Arthur Sterling," she said, her voice barely carrying over the beep of the heart monitor. "The man who built the foundation." "My name is Julian, Miss Sinclair," the janitor replied softly, his eyes steady. "Arthur Sterling was the name your company took from me when they told the board I was dead." Julian's words hung in the sterile air, heavier than the cold mist of the ventilation system. The name Arthur Sterling was written in the foundation stones of Biomedica, etched into the early patents of every robotic joint, every haptic feedback sensor, and every automated surgical pathway the company owned. To Claire, he had been a mythical figure, a tragic genius her father used to speak of in hushed, reverent tones. A man who had allegedly suffered a complete mental breakdown after his wife's death and walked away from a $20 million parachute. But looking at the quiet man standing before her, his graying hair cropped close and his hands stained with industrial solvent, she saw no madness. She saw the crushing weight of a corporate lie. You're Arthur Sterling," Claire whispered, her voice stripped of its executive armor. "My father told me you retired to a private estate in Scotland. He said the company paid for your lifetime care." "Your father paid for my silence, Miss Sinclair," Julian said, his voice entirely devoid of anger, stating it with the flat, objective precision of an engineer reading a schematic. "When my wife, Eleanor, died in that lab explosion 8 years ago, it wasn't an accident. It was a premature test run forced by Charles to meet a venture capital deadline. When I threatened to go to the federal prosecutors, your father and Charles gave me a choice. I could sign over my patents and take a quiet guard job in the basement with a health insurance policy that would cover my newborn daughter's medical bills, or they would tie me up in litigation until I was bankrupt and CPS took Mia away from me. I chose my daughter." He looked through the glass at Mia, who was now sitting back down, her small hand resting on Echo's golden head. "I stayed in the basement because I wanted to be near the only thing I had left to protect," Julian added. "And because I knew that one day Charles would try to run this machine past its physical limits, and I wanted to be close enough to keep it from killing someone." "This is slander," Charles roared, his eyes darting to the security guards, who were now standing near the doors with their heads bowed, refusing to meet his gaze. "Claire, don't listen to him. He's a disgraced technician. The board will never accept his word over my published research." "Your published research is a translation of my old notebooks, Charles," Julian said softly. "And right now, your translation has a fatal error." Before Charles could speak, the anesthesia monitor beside the operating table let out a sudden, frantic sequence of high-pitched chimes. The smooth green line of William Harrington's heart rate began to stutter, the numbers on the display flashing an angry, pulsing orange. "We have a localized arterial bleed," the lead surgical assistant shouted, her hands flying to the manual suction line. The automated suture was only 80% complete when the lockout occurred. "The internal pressure is rising. If we don't complete the primary anastomosis in the next 10 minutes, the patient will suffer an irreversible thoracic hemorrhage." "Restart the automated sequence," Claire ordered, her voice rising in a panic. "We can't!" the assistant cried, her forehead slick with sweat. "The automated path is corrupted because of the forced lock. If we try to run the pre-programmed route now, the software won't recognize the shifted position of the cardiac wall. The robot will cut the wrong artery." "Charles, take the manual controls," Claire demanded, turning on her chief scientific officer. "Use the haptic joysticks. Complete the suture by hand." Charles stepped toward the secondary console, his hands shaking so violently that he dropped his optical stylus twice. He gripped the haptic joysticks, the highly sensitive controllers designed to translate a surgeon's hand movements into microscopic adjustments of the robotic arms. But the moment his fingers touched the pads, the monitors began to scream with warning alerts. "The force feedback is too high," Charles stammered, his face turning a sickly shade of green. I can't feel the resistance. The haptic sensors are out of calibration because of the thermal expansion. If I push too hard, I'll tear the aorta. I can't do it, Claire. It's a blind procedure without the auto-calibration." "He can't do it because he's never actually operated the system," Julian said, stepping forward. He didn't ask for permission. He walked directly to the sterile preparation station, tore open a pack of surgical gloves, and began pulling them over his broad, calloused hands with a quiet, practiced ease. The Aegis X doesn't use digital haptics. It uses an analog tension loop. You don't read the resistance on a screen, Charles. You have to feel it in the springs of the controller. Suddenly, from the other side of the glass, Echo let out a sharp, urgent bark. The golden retriever stood up, his 3 legs bracing against the floor, his head pointed directly at the heavy steel electrical cabinet mounted against the far wall of the cleanroom. He let out a low, continuous growl, his nose twitching frantically. Julian froze, his hand stopping midway into his second glove. He sniffed the air. "Ozone," Julian said, his eyes turning to the electrical cabinet. "The backup power inverter. When Charles forced the motor velocity to 150%, it didn't just lock the joints. It overloaded the secondary power bus. The insulation on the coils is melting. The sensors aren't showing an electrical leak, the technician at the corner console said, checking her diagnostics, because Charles bypassed the thermal sensors to prevent the system from shutting down during the live press feed, Julian said, his voice dropping into a cold, hard register. In 5 minutes, that cabinet is going to blow the main breaker. The clean room will lose power. The backup generators will take 10 seconds to cycle, and in those 10 seconds, the robotic arms will lose their active suspension. They'll drop. And when they drop, the scalpel will fall. Claire felt the room spin. The press was still waiting outside. Her father's legacy, the $3 billion launch, the life of her mentor, everything was resting on a knife edge, and the knife was about to lose power. "Julian," Claire whispered, her hand reaching out to touch the sleeve of his blue jumpsuit. "What do we do?" Julian looked at her, his eyes searching her face for any trace of the arrogant CEO who had swiped his son's soup container off the table an hour ago. He saw only a frightened woman who had finally learned to look at the truth. "Go to the basement power room," Julian said. "There is a manual transfer switch behind the primary cooling column. It bypassed the automated system. You have to flip it by hand to route the clean room's power directly to the auxiliary turbine. It will bypass the melting inverter." "But the basement is a high-voltage zone," Claire said, her voice trembling. "I don't have the technical clearance." "You don't need clearance to pull a handle, Ms. Sinclair," Julian said, stepping toward the haptic controller. "You just need the courage to get your hands dirty." He turned to his daughter through the glass, signing with a swift, fluid motion of his gloved hands. "Stay with Echo, Mia. Keep your ears open." Mia, nodded, her small hand tightening around Echo's collar. The dog stopped barking, but his body remained tense, his eyes locked on his master. Julian sat in the master surgeon's chair. He gripped the haptic controllers, his calloused fingers settling into the carbon fiber rings. He didn't look at the screens. He closed his eyes, his breathing slowing to a deep, rhythmic crawl that matched the steady beep of William Harrington's heart monitor. "Initiating manual override," Julian whispered. "May, the song is still B-flat. Let's finish the dance." Claire didn't stop to think. She turned on her heel and sprinted toward the secure exit, her Italian leather heels clicking a frantic, desperate rhythm against the concrete corridor. As she reached the heavy fire door leading to the service stairwell, she felt her left heel catch on a metal threshold. With a sharp, cracking sound, the wooden heel snapped. Without a second of hesitation, Claire kicked the shoes off entirely. She stood in her torn silk stockings on the cold, gritty concrete of the stairwell, her expensive corporate uniform suddenly feeling like nothing more than a hindrance. She pushed the heavy steel door open and plunged down into the darkness of the basement. The service stairs were steep, unpainted, and smelled of damp earth and heavy machinery. She ran down 3 flights, her feet stinging as they hit the cold concrete, her breathing coming in ragged, painful gasps. The basement of the Biomedica facility was a vast, subterranean maze of roaring pipes, massive cooling towers, and high-voltage conduits that buzzed with a low, menacing energy. It was a place she had never once visited in her 5 years as CEO, a place she had assumed was safely managed by people beneath her concern. Now those people and their world were the only things keeping her alive. She navigated the dim corridors, following the thick, black copper conduits that lined the ceiling. The air grew warmer, thick with the smell of heavy grease, ozone, and steam. She turned a corner and saw the primary cooling column, a massive 30-foot cylinder of condensation-streaked steel that vibrated with a deafening, low-frequency roar. Behind it, half shrouded in the steam of a pressure relief valve, was the manual transfer station. It was a heavy, industrial-grade steel box, rusted at the hinges, with a massive 3-foot iron handle painted a faded, warning red. The label above the handle, covered in a thick layer of yellowed grease, read, "Manual Direct Erect Override, Auxiliary Turbine Only." Claire stepped into the hot steam, her face slick with sweat, her hair pulling loose from its tight knot. She reached out and grabbed the iron handle. It was burning hot to the touch, the metal vibrating with the raw, terrifying force of the electricity humming behind the steel plating. She gritted her teeth, throwing her entire weight onto the iron bar. It didn't budge. Come on, Claire gasped, her hands slipping on the greasy metal. She took a step back, braced her bare feet against the wet concrete floor, and wrapped her arms around the handle, pulling downward with every ounce of strength her polished, executive body possessed. Move! Upstairs in the clean room, the situation was descending into a silent, high-stakes ballet. Julian sat in the master surgeon's chair, his hands buried in the haptic controller rings. He didn't look at the primary screens, which were now flickering wildly as the voltage from the melting inverter fluctuated. Instead, he kept his eyes on the auxiliary haptic diagnostic monitor, which displayed a simple circular coordinate system representing the tension of the robotic needles. Internal pressure is still rising, the surgical assistant reported, her voice trembling as she kept the suction line steady. We're at 95. If we don't complete the primary stitch in the next 3 minutes, the tissue will tear. I have the needle, Julian said, his voice a calm, hypnotic anchor in the room. He didn't use the automated pathing. With microscopic movements of his fingers, he guided the carbon fiber arms of the Aegis X. He didn't look at the surgical field, he felt it. Through the haptic rings, he could feel the exact density of William Harrington's cardiac wall. He could feel the slight, elastic resistance of the healthy tissue versus the stiff, brittle texture of the calcified valve. To Charles, who was watching from the corner, it was black magic. He's operating blind, Charles whispered, his hands clawing at his gown. He's not using the optical tracking. It's impossible to maintain that level of spatial awareness without the digital guides. The digital guides are slow, Charles, Julian said, his fingers moving 3 millimeters to the left, pulling a suture line through the tissue with the delicate grace of a lace maker. They rely on a camera that has a 30-millisecond latency. In 30 milliseconds, a heart can shift 2 millimeters. If you're not feeling the metal, you're just guessing. Suddenly, the overhead fluorescent lights in the clean room flared a blinding, violent violet. A loud electrical pop sounded from the heavy steel cabinet against the wall, followed by a thick, acrid plume of black smoke that began to billow from the vents. The primary console screens went completely dark. The heart monitor's steady beep died, replaced by a low, continuous warning tone from the auxiliary battery. "The main inverter is blown!" the technician screamed, throwing her hands over her head as sparks showered from the ceiling vents. "We've lost primary power!" The 4 titanium arms of the Aegis X shivered, their internal pneumatic pressure dropping. The arm holding the active surgical needle began to sag, its carbon fiber joint slowly dropping toward the patient's exposed chest. "Julian!" the assistant shrieked. "The arm is falling!" Julian didn't pull his hands out of the haptic rings. He braced his forearms against the console frame, locking his skeletal structure to provide a physical break for the controllers. His shoulder muscles bunched, the heavy blue cotton of his jumpsuit straining as he manually held the haptic linkage in place through sheer, raw physical force. "Don't move," Julian whispered, his teeth gritted, his face flushed with an intense, agonizing strain. "Claire, flip the switch." Through the glass, Mia stood with her hands pressed flat against the pane, her small voice rising over the mechanical wail of the alarms. "Papa, the river is coming. I can hear it." Beside her, Echo let out a deep, booming bark, his tail thumping once, twice, 3 times against the corridor floor. In the damp, steam-filled basement, Claire let out a primal, guttural scream. She ignored the heat of the iron handle burning through her palms. She threw her entire body weight downward, her feet slipping on the wet concrete, her shoulders slamming against the steel casing of the cooling column. With a deafening metallic clack, the heavy iron handle finally broke through its decade of rust, dropping 3 feet into the lock position. Deep beneath the floorboards, a massive 30-ton auxiliary turbine, powered by the facility's private hydro generator, roared to life. The sound was a deep, thunderous vibration that shook the very foundations of the building, a mechanical wave that traveled up through 30 floors of steel and glass. In the clean room, the darkness was instantly shattered. The overhead lights flickered back to life, glowing with a steady, pure white light that was entirely free of the previous 60 Hz flicker. The primary console screens flashed, their interfaces loading in a clean, golden hue. "Auxiliary power connected," the synthetic voice reported. "Voltage stable, system nominal." The pneumatic systems of the Aegis X hissed, the pressure returning to 80 pounds per square inch. The falling surgical arm locked in place, exactly 1 millimeter above the patient's artery. Julian didn't pause to breathe. The moment the haptic controllers regained their active suspension, his fingers moved with a blinding, fluid speed. He completed the final 3 stitches of the anastomosis, pulled the suture line taut, and executed a perfect, hand-locked knot. "Suture complete," Julian said, his voice dropping back into its quiet, steady register. "Anastomosis secured. Check the flow." The surgical assistant slowly lowered her diagnostic probe into the field. She watched the monitor as the flow rate through the repaired valve began to rise, the numbers shifting from a dangerous, sluggish red to a bright, healthy blue. "No leaks," the assistant whispered, her eyes wide as she looked at Julian. "The flow is nominal. The valve it's perfect." The room was silent. Julian slowly pulled his hands out of the haptic rings. He stood up, his shoulders slumped with the profound, bone-deep exhaustion of a man who had just run a marathon with his fingers. He pulled his surgical gloves off, throwing them into the biohazard bin, and walked toward the double doors of the operating room. He pushed the doors open and walked out into the corridor. Mia was waiting. She didn't sign this time. She simply ran to him, her small arms wrapping around his waist, her head buried in his blue jumpsuit. Julian knelt, pulling her close, his hand resting on Echo's golden head as the dog licked the sweat from his forehead. Claire Sinclair came up the service stairs a minute later. She was barefooted, her stockings torn and stained with black grease, her expensive navy suit jacket gone, and her hands covered in rust and oil. She looked like a woman who had just fought her way out of a coal mine. But when she saw Julian sitting on the floor with his daughter and his dog, she stopped. She didn't look like a CEO. She looked like someone who had finally seen the foundation of her own house. "Julian," she said, her voice quiet and steady. Julian looked up. He gave her a single, unhurried nod. "We have some people to talk to," she said. The cleanroom doors remained open, the sterile seal broken by the reality of the morning. Inside, the medical team moved with a new, frantic efficiency, not the panic of a failing mission, but the urgent care required to transfer a stable, living human being. William Harrington was being prepped for the intensive care unit, his vitals tracing a rhythm that was as steady as a metronome. Dr. Charles Sterling stood in the corner of the theater, his hands still raised as if he were afraid to touch anything in a world that had suddenly outgrown him. He watched Julian, the man he had spent 8 years trying to bury, and for the first time, the arrogance in his eyes had been replaced by the hollow, glassy stare of a man who realized the ground beneath him was no longer solid. "Julian," Charles stammered, his voice thin and reedy. "Julian, listen to me. The power failure. It was a freak occurrence. My data, the core research. We can still frame this as a collaborative success. I'll make sure the board knows you were the technician who assisted. I'll double your settlement. I'll give you a laboratory in the North Wing." Julian didn't look at him. He was busy wiping a smudge of black grease off Mia's forehead with a corner of his jumpsuit. "Charles," Claire said, her voice like the crack of a whip in the silent room. She stepped forward, her bare feet leaving faint, dusty prints on the polished floor. She looked at her chief scientific officer, the man who had stood by her father's side for 2 decades. She saw the sweat-stained silk, the expensive watch, and the absolute moral vacuum where a heart should have been. "You told me Arthur Sterling was a broken man," Claire said, her eyes burning. "You told me he had lost his mind to grief. You told the board that his patents were yours to refine. But today, the machine didn't recognize your voice, Charles. It didn't respond to your code. It waited for him." "It was an error in the haptic loop," Charles shouted, his face turning a deep, ugly purple. "He sabotaged it. He must have planted the lockout years ago just to wait for this moment." "The lockout was a failsafe to protect the patient from your greed," Julian said, finally standing up. He looked Charles directly in the eye, his gaze carrying the weight of 8 years of silence. "I didn't sabotage the machine, Charles. I built it to survive you. And the black box inside the primary server just recorded every haptic input from the last hour. It recorded the motor velocity at 150%. It recorded the bypassed thermal sensors. And most importantly, it recorded the biometric acoustic handshake. My voice, not yours. Julian turned to Claire. The Aegis X doesn't lie, Ms. Sinclair. It keeps a record of its creator's soul. Claire turned to the security guards, the same men she had ordered to arrest Julian only minutes before. Secure Dr. Sterling's office. Seize every server, every notebook, and every communication log from the last 10 years. Call the federal investigators. I want a full audit of every patent filed under the Sterling-Sinclair partnership. Claire, you can't do this, Charles screamed as the guards stepped forward, their expressions stony. Your father and I, we built this empire together. My father is gone, Charles, Claire said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried to every corner of the room. And I think you'd be ashamed to know that the only thing holding up this empire was a man in a blue jumpsuit in the basement. As the guards led a sobbing, protesting Charles Sterling out of the room, the clean room finally fell into a true, peaceful quiet. The technicians returned to their consoles, their heads bowed, working with a newfound reverence for the system they were monitoring. The formal press conference was scheduled for 2 o'clock that afternoon. The global media had been waiting for 4 hours, their cameras positioned like a firing squad in front of the Biomedica Grand Lobby. Rumors of a technical glitch and a near-catastrophic failure had already begun to circulate, and the company's stock was vibrating on the edge of a freefall. Claire Sinclair walked onto the stage at exactly 2:05 p.m. She was no longer wearing the grease-stained stockings or the torn suit. She had changed into a simple, sharp black dress, her hair pulled back into a severe, professional knot. But she wasn't alone. Standing to her right was a man in a tailored charcoal suit that looked both comfortable and authoritative on his broad frame. His hair was cropped close, his face clean-shaven, and his eyes carried the steady, unblinking clarity of a man who had finally stepped out of the shadows. Members of the press, Claire began, her voice steady and resonant. Today was supposed to be a demonstration of a machine, but instead, it became a demonstration of a truth. For the past 8 years, Biomedica has operated under a profound and costly shadow. We allowed ourselves to believe that innovation was a matter of ownership and titles. We were wrong. She paused, the cameras flashing frantically. The life of William Harrington was saved today not by a software update or a corporate strategy, but by the hands of the man who truly built the Aegis X. Today, I am proud to announce the return of our founding Chief Technology Officer, a man whose name was unjustly erased from our records, but whose genius never left our halls. She turned to Julian, her expression softening for a fraction of a second. I'd like to introduce you to the true architect of the future, Mr. Arthur Sterling. The room erupted. The name Arthur Sterling was legendary in the inner circles of the aerospace and medical industries, a ghost story of a talent lost too soon. Julian stepped to the microphone, his hands resting calmly on the podium. He didn't look at the cameras. He looked out at the back of the room where Mia was sitting in the front row, wearing a new dress and clutching Echo's leash. The three-legged dog was sitting perfectly still, his amber eyes fixed on his master. Julian didn't give a long speech. He didn't talk about the betrayal or the years in the basement. He talked about the machine. He talked about the harmony of engineering and the responsibility that comes with building things that hold the lives of others. A machine is only as good as the intention of the person who built it, Julian said. And from this day forward, Biomedica will be a company that listens to the metal and the people who work it. The aftermath of the Aegis crisis was swift and total. Charles Sterling was indicted on 17 counts of industrial espionage, fraud, and reckless endangerment. The investigation into his past revealed a decade-long trail of suppressed safety reports and stolen research. The Sinclair family estate was hit with a massive civil suit, which Claire chose not to fight, instead using the settlement funds to establish the Eleanor Sterling Foundation for medical research and worker protection. William Harrington made a full recovery. 3 weeks after the surgery, he walked into the Biomedica facility under his own power, heading not for the executive suite, but for the newly reopened Foundations Laboratory in the West Wing. It was a laboratory like no other. There were no white marble floors or high-gloss finishes. It was a space of exposed brick, heavy steel workbenches, and the smell of hot solder and machine oil. At the center of the room, Julian was leaning over a prototype of a new, low-cost prosthetic limb, his fingers moving with the same lacemaker grace he had used in the cleanroom. Mia was there too, sitting at a small desk in the corner, her toy stethoscope replaced by a real student-grade model. She was checking the heart of a carbon fiber robotic joint while Echo lay at her feet, his tail thumping a rhythmic, happy greeting. Claire Sinclair stood at the doorway, holding a folder of new patent filings. She watched them for a moment, the titan of industry looking at the man who had taught her how to get her hands dirty. The board approved the new budget for the community apprenticeship program, Claire said, walking over. We have 60 applicants for the first class, all from the local trade schools. Julian looked up, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. The first real smile Claire had ever seen on his face. 60, he said. That's a good foundation. They want to know if the chief technology officer will be teaching the first lecture, Claire added. Julian looked at Mia, then at the machine on his workbench. I'll be there, but I have a condition. Another handle to pull? Claire asked with a laugh. No, Julian said. I want them to start the first day in the basement. I want them to hear the pipes roar and the turbines hum. I want them to understand that you can't reach the sky until you know exactly what's holding you up. Claire nodded, reaching out to pat Echo's head. I think I can arrange that. The story of Biomedica changed that year. It stopped being a story of stock prices and billion-dollar launches and became a story of the silent surgeon, the man who saved a kingdom with a lullaby and a mop. On a rainy Tuesday evening, long after the press had moved on to the next scandal, Julian walked out of the Biomedica building with Mia and Echo. He wasn't carrying a briefcase or an executive phone. He was carrying Mia's backpack and a small wooden model of a heart they had built together that afternoon. As they reached the parking lot, Julian stopped. He looked back at the massive glass tower, the lights of the office floors glowing like stars in the dark. He remembered the cold floor of the clean room, the venom in Claire's voice, and the sound of the machines screaming. Papa? Mia asked, tugging on his hand. Are you sad? Julian looked down at his daughter, the girl who had heard the song inside the noise. He knelt, pulling her close, the rain falling softly on his charcoal suit. No, Mia, Julian whispered, his voice full and steady. I'm just listening. What do you hear? She asked. Julian closed his eyes, feeling the vibration of the city, the steady thump of Echo's heart, and the quiet, rhythmic breathing of the child in his arms. I hear the harmony, he said, and for the first time in a long time, it's perfectly in tune. The three of them walked toward their car, a modest, reliable sedan that had seen better days, but whose engine sang with a precision that no factory could ever replicate. As they drove away, the lights of the Biomedica tower faded into the mist, a monument no longer to the power of one, but to the quiet, unbreakable strength of the foundation.